All right, friends, welcome to our second event, Three Talks. I think that you will find follow very well on what John just did in his keynote address. Uh, and three of our speakers who have been deeply committed to making God's beauty known in their ministries and who come at it from somewhat different perspectives and yet share a lot in common. Uh, Kevin Twit for music, Joe Cory, visual art, Debra Murphy, her work as a theologian and a Christian ethicist. And so we're looking forward very much to the time. Now, what we're going to do is each speaker will give their talk, and then following the three talks, we'll have a good opportunity for you to engage with them in question and answer. And hopefully the conversation will be a rich one, drawing from what each of them say as we think about the beauty of God in worship and preaching and worship in the arts. Kevin Twit is the Reformed University Fellowship Campus Minister at Belmont University. But one of the things that we were just talking about that interests me about his work is that he's been very engaged in recovering of old hymns and putting text of old hymns to modern singable music. And he's found in campus ministry that young people love to sing the words of old hymns. And it makes the theology and the gospel in singable form accessible to him. And that's a wonderful thing, Kevin. Joe Cory is a professor of art here at Samford University, mentors Christian artists, very much involved in the work of Christianity and especially visual art. And I'm sure you've seen his contribution to the conference that it's at the very end of this hall. And so we look forward to what Joe has to say. Debra Murphy brings together her experience and her expertise in theology, in liturgy, and ethics in an integrative way, and with good focus on the beauty of God. The two books that are listed in the bio, I recommend highly. I appreciate them and have learned much from them in my work. So thank you to our speakers. And Kevin, we'll now turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you. Glad to be here. Boy, I'm so glad to follow John Whitfleet. That's always a helpful thing. I told him I was feeling a little anxious. Maybe it's a little PTSD. I'm a PCA minister, so conservative, reformed folks who have a very high view of the Bible is my tribe, which means often the idea that you would do music that's outside of the Western classical tradition is anathema. And I've certainly received lots of emails and criticisms to my face over the years. But I did want to expand on the idea of God's beauty being more than just one particular tradition and why that's important. I was actually speaking on a panel at the Getty conference, Sing conference a few years ago, and somebody brought up that question. And one of the other people, you know how panels are sometimes, somebody says something like, oh, I wish you hadn't said that. But somebody was asked about musical style, and he said, well, it doesn't really matter as long as the words are true. And I said, with all due respect, that's either, at best, a majority culture naivete, but maybe Gnostic, because all musical styles have cultural baggage. And all of them reflect God's beauty in various ways. And that's really the heart of what I want to say, is that God's beauty through music is multidimensional because it's not something we derive just from the created order, sort of aesthetic absolutes from the created order, but music is part of how human beings are working with the stuff that God has made and stamped with meaning. And so it's always human covenantal obedience. And that's why I think musical style matters. I'm so happy that we're exploring the idea of beauty and the way John set it up with it's both sublime and cruciform. And I told him, one time I was talking to Mako Fujimura, visual artist, some of you may know, about this idea of aesthetic absolutes. And he said there's a parallel movement in the visual arts trying to kind of derive from the light form the light waveform, what true beauty is. He goes, I don't really think that works very well. I think the cross is the ultimate. And then he pointed me to Zechariah 3. Zechariah 3 is really one of the ugliest pictures in the Bible that's also one of the most beautiful. And you see that because you see the high priest Yeshua standing before the Lord on the Day of Atonement, covered in, most translations say filthy clothes, but it's really the word for excrement. It's not a beautiful picture, but it is a beautiful picture because it says that these men here are symbolic of things that are going to happen one day when what they do will heal the land of its sin in a single day. And so I just think this is so helpful. I was also thinking about the importance of art and beauty because I work with college students, and as you might know, Taylor Swift's Midnight's album released just a couple days ago, right? And I can't just tell you, the anticipation, not just among students, right? Yeah, everybody knows, and you've probably all heard that record already, right? I imagine at least the people in the front row here have. I was reminded of a line from the art critic Peter Fuller. He says this, that given the ever-present absence of God, I think he means in our culture, art and the gamut of aesthetic experience provides the sole remaining glimmer of transcendence. But it's not just the sublime. And that's what I want to explore a little bit today. So, as he mentioned, I've made these records with Indelible Grace, trying to set old hymns to new music. And one of the things that really helped that work along was a worship renewal grant that we got from Calvin. That's how I met John. That's how I met so many wonderful people that have been really invaluable and I've learned so much from. And one of the things that, they don't do this with grants anymore, I don't think. We did a conference, we put together a worship resource, and we did a tour. And I don't think they fund any of those things anymore. But we got in back in the good old days, I suppose. But when we did a tour of some of this music, going around to PCA churches and seminaries, a bit of criticism and controversy erupted, at least in our little PCA, Presbyterian Church in America world, about how inappropriate it was to put these God-glorifying hymn texts to rock music. I don't really think that what we do is rock music all the time, but yeah, some of it is. But I think it was interesting. I responded to some of the criticisms. Some of them, I think, were a little naive about, music and beauty and how it works, and certainly church history and the role of popular music and that. But what was really interesting to me and really surprising was the response that I got from, really, there's not very many African-American pastors in the PCA, certainly were less then, but many of them wrote me privately when I responded publicly to the criticism and said, this is a fight worth fighting. Because if they're not open to any other musical style outside of the Western classical tradition, how are they ever going to welcome us, right? So this stuff does matter. A few years after that, I was asked to lead worship and give a seminar at the PCA, Global Missions Conference. So I thought it would be helpful to take up the topic, does musical style matter? Aesthetic barriers to missional ministry. And even considering how we might love our neighbors by taking seriously the way God has worked through them and their culture. And after the address, I was approached by a guy, concerned gentleman, who entered into a spirited discussion. The interesting thing in this case was I had a student from Jackson State University who was playing bass with me there, an African-American guy named Tim. And so he was kind of listening in the conversation in this case. And it was extraordinary to me. At one point, I literally said to this gentleman, do you think that Tim needs to sing 17th century Scottish psalm tunes to be truly glorifying to God, to be like the apex of glory? And the guy said, well, it's okay to do music he likes to get him into the church, but then we would hope to elevate his taste. And it's shocking, it's sad, but it's still a live issue, at least from where I sit. I'd like to contend that it's a live issue, particularly what's almost ironic is the more conservative and the higher view people have of the Bible, the way they've almost made such a tight link between the Western classical tradition and the Bible. And if you would raise a question about it, it's like you've attacked the Bible itself, and I think that's really unfortunate and misses one of the most important teachings of the Bible regarding culture and the church that God is building from every race, tribe, and tongue. So I want to offer a few provocative, admittedly, thoughts on musical style and why we need to embrace a bigger view of beauty and the God-glorifying potential that he has built into his creation. And I'll start with a quote from one of my heroes, Jeremy Begbie. If you don't know his book, Resounding Truth, he addresses this topic in particular in chapter 3 on the great tradition and the music of the spheres and those kinds of ideas. And he says this: if I were to walk onto a platform to give a piano recital and introduce the evening by telling the audience that I was about to help them tune into the order of the cosmos, that some of the pieces I was about to play were more cosmically in tune than others, and that the best pieces would help them be finer people and bring them that much closer to the Creator, the audience might well conclude I needed therapy. Yet for centuries in the West, this thinking or something like it was the norm. Indeed, it was so dominant and persistent, it is sometimes called the great tradition. And it raises the question, can we actually derive musical standards of beauty from the created order? I would contend no. And the reason is because music is not just about physics and aesthetics. It's human culture interacting with the stuff that God has created and bringing out various aspects of the God-glorifying potential with regard to sound that he has built into his creation. If you're looking for resources, there was an article in the Calvin Theological Journal, 2002, by a guy named Ted Turnow on reflecting theologically upon popular culture as meaningful. Really, really helpful. And what he talks about in there is the idea in Psalm 19 that the creation is declaring God's praise. It's not passive witness for us to use to say there's a creator, because look, there's a creation and it shows, order and design. That's fine. But he says what Psalm 19 is saying is the creation is proclaiming, it's preaching at us. And we're all hearing it, and we're all interacting with it, responding to it, sometimes amplifying what it's saying, sometimes trying to erase the meaning God has built into the creation and say something else. That's idolatry. And this dynamic push-pull is always going on with everyone, Christian or not. It's why we need to pay attention, and it's why we need to be careful in what we listen to, right? He says that most Christian thinking about popular culture regards popular culture as either dangerous or trivial. And of course, it can't be both, because if it's truly dangerous, it's not trivial. And if it's truly trivial, how dangerous is it, right? So I want us to think a little bit about that kind of stuff. Unlike the Greek ideas of music stolen from the gods, William Edgar, who's a recently retired professor from Westminster Seminary, in his excellent, though out-of-print book, Taking Note of Music, calls music a kind of covenantal obedience, a way of glorifying him and enjoying him. And he's a Presbyterian, so you would think he would say that, right? And as I said, Ted Turnow points this out about Psalm 19. So you cannot derive musical aesthetic ideals from the created order itself, because music is made from what man has done with God's creation. And I'll give you a couple examples. And what's interesting to me is how people with music degrees hold up some of these things as sort of evidence that the created order is what we look to understand what beauty is. The natural harmonic overtone series. I heard a man gave a talk just the other day and talked about the overtones in the fifth and the octave. That's great. But the overtone series also includes the blue note, which you can't play on your piano. It's in between a sharp second and a flat third. For the chord to really sound right, you have to detune the third of the chord just a little bit. I know this from making records in the studio. I can't just tune my guitar to a tuner. I have to tune the third of the chord, whatever key I'm in, a little bit flat, right? I can play that harmonic on my guitar around the third fret. It's in the natural harmonic series, but it's not on your piano. So when people go to the piano and say, this is consonant, this is in tune, number one, they've got the harmonic series, which doesn't fit that, and number two, you have tempered tuning. The only reason that your piano sounds in tune to you is conditioning. Some of you know, like how piano tuners do their work, right? They listen for the wow, 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 the beats, they call it, when two notes are almost the same. And there's a formula for how out of tune everything needs to be so that you can play in all the keys. So tempered tuning also shows us that what sounds consonant and right to us is not purely a matter of physics and the created order. There's another. You can actually, how you hear things is a complex process rooted in the created order. It's not disconnected completely from your body. There's not infinite variety to this, but the social context and the era in which you live has a role to play as well. This was brought home to me when I went to Berklee College of Music, and I had a guy named Ed Tomasi, who was a very intense gentleman, teaching harmony, and he just would regularly scream basically this line: "You cats have got to get your ears happening. You need to listen to Bird and Train." Listen, when I started out listening to that stuff, that sounded weird. When bebop first came on, everybody's like, those notes are wrong, right? But the more you hear it, the more your ears open to flat 13 and flat 9. And I even got a flat 5th in a worship tune, and I'm still really proud of that. There's a lot of God-glorifying potential in the creation with regard to music. No culture fully explored it. Bach is great, right? There's so much wonderful, beautiful music. But not all music should be evaluated by criteria derived from trying to understand what some kinds of music, how they work. Because different musics work different ways. If I had more time, I'd talk about intentional and extensional development. You know, building small motifs into bigger, grander pieces versus taking a 12-bar blues and introducing subtle variations every time you do it. There are two different ways to introduce interest and creativity into music. And if you pick one of them as the normative, then the other will not really stand up so well. But why should we do that? So can we talk about good and bad art? Are those valid categories? I think it's helpful to remember that whenever you say good, you usually are bringing in telos or purpose, often without realizing it. Good for what? This is a point brought out another Calvin professor, I don't know if he's still there, Quentin Schultz, really helped me because I'd come to understand Reformed theology and I'm reading all this stuff, but I went to Berklee College of Music and the way people were talking about music in my tribe just wasn't ringing true. And he came and did a seminar at Charlie Peacock's art house. It was probably around 91 or so, and talked about the purpose of art is the purpose of what it means to be human. The only big enough purpose is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. And so much goes wrong when we elevate a sub-purpose, a valid sub-purpose, to the overarching purpose. So when you talk about beauty, but you also want to talk about speaking truth. And sometimes, particularly in a fallen world, those are in conflict. That's where you get the cruciform and the sublime sometimes kind of clashing with one another. To speak truthfully about brokenness. I think it was Bill Egger that talked about the problem of optimism and pessimism in art. And he says, the optimist is the one who believes we're living in the best of all possible worlds, and the pessimist believes that may be true, right? But how much of our music really covers the whole gamut? To reference Calvin again, the Psalms express the whole range of human emotions. And how do we bring that out in our music and our art? I think what the Bible encourages in Philippians 4:8 is to commend whatever we can. And you see this Paul doing this in Acts 17 too. Like he goes around, he's very distressed, the Bible says, about all the idolatry he sees there in Athens. But the first thing out of his mouth is he commends, I see that you are very religious. There is always something to commend. Anything created by humans can't help but give evidence to God's creativity. Even if they use the breath He gave Him to curse His name, they can't escape honoring Him in some ways with what has been made. And of course, no music is pure and without flaws. So Harold Best, who used to be the dean of the School of Music at Wheaton, says this: just as there is no universal music, there is no universal aesthetic. The trick is in locating and defining quality amidst the plethora of legitimate musics. It may be entirely wrong to say that musical pluralism in our present culture is legitimate only if it includes or is dominated by Western classical music. To hold this is to imply that even though excellence can exist in other forms of music, it is derivative or contingent. And that's just not the case. But I always think, I had this question just the other day. Why is it that so few Christian colleges make room for the full breadth of musics? So I work at Belmont University. It's known for modern music, recording engineering, commercial music, all that. But, if you want to play commercial guitar, you have to do 2 years of classical guitar. I can't tell you how many students I've had that have gotten tendonitis and had to drop out of that program because it's not the basis for playing electric guitar, right? Or you could go to Baylor and guitar's not even a recognized instrument. So all the guitar players have to pretend they're singers. Why is it that all of these programs with such great resources still are kind of trapped in this kind of world? I don't know. I don't set out curriculum. That's not my thing. But I all the time have students who come that are looking at Belmont and maybe suss out that it's not as conservative in its theological approach as they might be looking for, but all the places that are more conservative theologically are more completely in the Western classical kind of world. My own son went to Covenant College, wonderful college, but he majored in graphic design rather than music, even though music's what he really wants to do. Fortunately, he connected with James Ward, who was in the jazz band, and he learned and did a lot of music there. But I just think this is really kind of strange. And it seems to me that the church, particularly people that take the Bible seriously, should be taking the various kinds of music in the world seriously as well. The biblical vision of the kings of all the earth at the end of Revelation, bringing their glory into the heavenly city. If you've not read Richard Mouw's book about that, you really should. And the biblical caution of Galatians, warning us against believing there's one pure cultural expression of the gospel, should be pondered more. I really do think sometimes when I hear people make the arguments about musical style, I really fear they get close to the Galatians heresy of believing that there's one pure cultural expression of the gospel. And if there was one, it would have been the one that included here's how you dress and here's how you eat, right? That God had revealed those sorts of things, right? And that's a hard thing to break free from, to realize that God might actually be wanting to bring glory through the kings of the earth. But that's the theme of the Bible. That's the development of the story, right? So here's another quote from Begbie that I think is worth paying attention to. As more and more non-Western music is made accessible, we are becoming far more conscious of what anthropologists of music, ethnomusicologists, and there are ethnodoxologists, which would be wonderful if we learned more about them, have long been telling us that there is no such thing as music, only musics. Finding a definition of music that encompasses Indonesian gamelan and, say, J.S. Bach's St. John Passion seems well nigh impossible. Not only does applying our categories of musical appreciation to other musics often make little sense, but the attempt to use even our concept of music in other cultural settings runs into grave difficulties. And of course, behind the desire to speak globally and monolithically of music, there often lies more than a whiff of Western conceit and hegemony. A presumption that our music represents the genuine and most advanced article and any other purported music is to be treated as inferior to it. Now, he's an incredible classical pianist. He's on the music faculty at Cambridge and the theology faculty. I think this is really worth paying attention to. There's, of course, a long history of theologians and church leaders making strange judgments about music. I won't go through this. You probably know most of these. The diabolus in music, right? The tritone, the augmented fourth, which is at the center of so much kind of modern music. Some of you are probably old enough to remember Bill Gothard's little tract, 10 Scriptural Reasons Why the Rock Beat is Evil in Any Form. And it's awful. It's just awful. One of them is because the backbeat comes from Africa, and so we know it must be pagan. The other 9 reasons basically amount to your parents don't like it and you should submit to your parents. But if you know anything about Bill Gothard, that won't surprise you. Even Calvin opposed, I think I'm right about this, John, singing Genevan Psalms in harmony at church, but published harmonized versions right from the beginning to sing in families, which is just odd. Why is it that that's not an expression of unity to sing in harmony at church? And of course, did he believe that he has one line where he talks about moderating each of the psalms, which seems to be if you get a tune for each of the 150 psalms, then we're good. And when Louis Bourgeois tried to change one of his tunes, he got thrown in jail. Calvin went and got him out, so that's good. But so even people that have great things to say sometimes have blind spots with regard to this. And I don't know if you know this, the controversy over setting new tunes to older texts is nothing new. I think this is hilarious. I just wanted to share it with you. 1723, Thomas Sims, about those objecting to new psalm tunes. He summarized the arguments. It's a new way, an unknown tongue. It's not so melodious as the usual way. There are so many new tunes, we shall never done learning them. The practice creates disturbances and causes people to behave indecently and disorderly. I'm not sure what was happening. Maybe they were like swaying with their body a little bit. This one I don't understand. It's Quakerish and Popish and introducive of instrumental music. The names given to the notes are bawdy, even blasphemy. He's talking about solfege here, okay? And this is the trump card for any argument. It's a needless way since our fathers got to heaven without it. It's a contrivance to get money. People spend too much time learning it. They tarry out nights disorderly, and of course, they're a company of young upstarts that fall in with this way, and some of them are lewd and loose persons. Let me just summarize and close this. Why does musical style matter? Because we've been placed in a world full of God-glorifying potential and told to work to cultivate it, and no one culture has fully explored all that potential. It takes every race, tribe, and tongue to do that, and the church should be leading the charge in that work. It matters because it's a way of loving our neighbors and honoring what they have made of the God-glorifying potential God has given us. Marva Dawn said one time, if our churches really reflected the kind of diversity they should, everybody should expect to sing some songs they don't like. And that's a spiritual maturity issue. And it matters because there's no one pure cultural expression of the gospel, and we must be careful to express that. That's why I'm fond of Brian Wren's suggestion that rather than thinking about blended worship, we're thinking about singing our songs and other people's songs, because this expresses two theological realities, rather than just trying to compromise to keep everybody happy, which never really works. But we should sing songs that honor the particular church we are in time and space, the particular history that we've come from. We're incarnate in a particular culture. Every church is. And we should sing songs that give voice to that. But we should also sing songs that remind us that the church is bigger than people that talk like us and sing like us. You can go cross-culturally. You can go back in time. You probably should do both. And that is all I have to say. Oh, I got to give you this, don't I?
All right, you'll have to give me a moment. I'm not a musician, and I don't wear microphones very often, so. All right, can you guys hear me okay? Okay, good. My wife asked me this morning if I was nervous at all, and I said, I'm an artist giving a talk at a preaching conference. Like, what do you think, honey? I mean, I feel a little bit like fish out of water, but I have really, even already, just in the two presentations we've heard, I've really appreciated what they've had to say, and a lot of what they've said actually overlaps some of my thinking, and so I feel like it's God ordained. But if you don't mind, I won't read the whole thing, but I wrote out what I was going to say, because again, I'm a fish out of water here, guys. And so, anyway, that's why I'm doing that. So anyway, I do want to give my appreciation to Emily and to Mike for the invitation to be here. And again, the opportunity to create a painting in kind of commemorance of this event. When they asked me, I was like, sure, yeah, I'd love to do that. And if you look around, there aren't a lot of paintings on the walls in this place. And so then I immediately was like, wow, this is kind of a big deal. And so I just assumed that they were going to put it in a closet when we were done. And they were like, no, we want to put it up permanently. And then I felt all this pressure of like, mine's the only one in the whole building. But anyway, I really appreciate the invitation. It's a huge honor to not only be here, like I said, but to be able to create something that hopefully speaks visually to what we're talking about this week. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the role of the artist in the church, and when I use the term artist, I'm speaking about visual artists, which is what I am, but I'm also talking about musicians and designers and architects and other artists as well. And I've been thinking about this role that artists play in the church now, and how they can effectively use their creativity to lead others towards a posture of worship for almost 20 years. After graduating with an art degree and being a Christian, there were a lot of questions of like, what are you gonna do? How do these two worlds overlap? And so I've been thinking about this for quite a while. And during that time, I've worked with dedicated pastors and staff from churches around the country to help their local kind of church community better embrace artists. And I've also been working with artists and tried to encourage them and really challenge them to find healthy ways to use their gifts for the church. And so in all of that time, I've learned one critically important thing. Every congregation is unique, but making room for artists in the church is important because artists can be a profound force to helping people engage with the Word of God, and more importantly, to help point others to the Lord. And so I'm gonna share kind of 3 stories today, or 3 illustrations that I think illustrate this. There we go. In July, I'm sure you're all familiar with this image. In July, NASA released the first picture from the James Webb Space Telescope. These now familiar images depict the deepest views of space that we've ever obtained. Some of the light in these images is said to have originated shortly after the universe's creation. When the pictures were released, they reverberated across the scientific community and captured our imaginations to the point of quickly becoming memes. Leave it to Twitter. What I think is funny is the guy did that at 4:48 a.m. I was like, what are you doing, bro? So in response to the pictures, some scientists wrote, the telescope, the Webb telescope, demonstrated the sensitivity, stability, image quality, and spectral range that are necessary to transform our understanding of the cosmos. When we encounter images like this one of the Inner Orion Nebula, or this picture of Jupiter, it's hard not to recognize the limits of our humanity and be amazed at the incredible wonder, power, and beauty of God's creation. But what many of you guys don't realize is that these images, as beautiful and striking as they are, they don't actually represent what we would see if we were staring out of the porthole of the USS Enterprise. This young woman, her name is Judy Schmidt of Modesto, California. Judy is an amateur astronomical image processor. She's part artist, graphic designer, and astronomy geek, and she works to translate the raw data from the telescope into the dramatic images of space that we've become so familiar at seeing. So the pictures do not depict what these planets, nebula, and galaxies would actually look like if we could see them with our own limited vision. Instead, the images represent a construction of invisible infrared rays and visible light filtered through the imagination of an artist who translates the data captured by the telescope. The data, which often comes from hundreds of different observations captured over time, is carefully woven into a beautiful and mesmerizing image by artists like Judy. So to put this differently, in order for us to see the fullness and beauty of the created cosmos, we need artists like Judy to faithfully interpret the information from the telescope through their creative imaginations. Does this sound familiar? So I'm convinced that the church needs artists. It needs painters, sculptors, designers, dancers, and musicians to use their imagination to inspire and orient congregations toward a greater posture of worship. But before I continue on, and at the risk of sounding like a little bit of a curmudgeon, I do think it's important to take a brief moment to offer a little bit of a warning. And I appreciated what John said kind of at the very end this morning, because my warning is going to, he was more gracious than I'm going to be. Let's just say that. Unfortunately, as the Protestant evangelical church has become more comfortable with embracing artists over the past 2 decades, and for those of us in the room who've been around a while, you got to, you guys probably, this is going to be new to you. Like, when I was an undergraduate 25 years ago, the church had no space for visual artists. They were very much like, I don't know what to do with you. At least my kind of evangelical church did. And so this kind of phenomena that has, and I don't think it's a coincidence, has kind of grown up alongside social media and Instagram and everybody having a camera in their pocket now, right? It's really about, the last 15, 20 years where I've seen churches warm up and become more comfortable. Well, again, I have to say evangelical because Catholics and Orthodox have been doing this forever, but evangelical churches, Protestant churches, have warmed up to this idea of using visual artists in the church and putting images back into the sanctuaries. And so anyway, I'm specifically here talking about the visual artists, although I expect this happens with other art forms as well. But as these churches have offered a more significant platform within their worship settings, I've really grown concerned at how many artists, especially some of your more prominent artists, view themselves within the church. And so unfortunately, too many of these artists, and a lot of them are my friends, are misguided about the role that they should play in the life of the church. And some of my friends and fellow artists believe their primary role in the church is to be a prophet. And they talk about this a lot. Artists are prophets, right? And I disagree with that. I think, sadly, many of these voices use those platforms instead of bringing glory to God. They use those platforms to bring glory to themselves and to promote themselves and to and I get it, you got to make money, but to monetize their brand, right? And so, again, church leaders, students in the room, hear me when I say this. You need to be really careful and discerning when you encounter this kind of misguided view, or you give platforms to artists who position themselves as prophets or gurus or spiritual directors. Far too often, their efforts translate into shallow theology or a destructive form of secular humanism that is repackaged to echo the voices of our culture rather than pointing others to the truth in Scripture of the gospel of Jesus Christ. All right, I'm going to take my curmudgeon hat off now. Again, I'm going to repeat this. I'm convinced the church needs artists. But instead of using your artists to attract the youth crowd or to seem edgy or relevant, I once had a guy ask me if I would paint in his service. It wasn't at my church. It was another worship kind of pastor in town. And I said, well, why? Like, what's the point? And he was like, well, it looks cool. And I was like, no, it's not good enough, guys. Again, I'm a curmudgeon. Anyway, or to merely just entertain your congregations, I really want to encourage you guys to look for the humble and spiritually mature artists who, like NASA's faithful image processors, will use their creativity and imagination to help your congregation experience the depth and beauty of God's Word, and who will inspire others towards a greater love of the Savior of the universe. So we see an example of this actually in the Bible in 1 Samuel when we're introduced to a young musician named David. As a kid, I learned about David on flannel graphs. Do you guys know what flannel graphs are? Do you all know what flannel, right? I am convinced that I'm an artist because of flannel graphs. Let me just say that, right? Like growing up in Sunday school, and I was so enamored by those things. Ask me afterwards, I'll tell you what flannel graphs are. Although I spoke to a missionary a few years ago, and he told me that flannel graphs are coming back because in other cultures that don't speak the language, it's easy to visually communicate the stories of the Bible. And I was like, yeah, it worked for me, man. Anyway, so flannel graphs, yeah. So I was introduced to David, the flannel graph David, and he was always presented with stones and a slingshot, ready to kill giants, right? And so it's easy for me to often forget that at the beginning, David was an artist, right? He was a musician. And so we learn about David at the end of 1 Samuel 16, where we read the Spirit of the Lord has departed from Saul, and he's tormented by a harmful spirit sent by the Lord. And to help ease his anxiety, Saul's servants suggest listening to music. and one of the servants recommends David. The servant tells the miserable king that David is skillful in playing, a man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, and a man of good presence. And most importantly, the servant proclaims, "The Lord is with him." So David's godly reputation preceded him. So Saul sends a message for David's father Jesse to send his son who was out with the sheep. And again, I imagine David just strumming his, I'll call it guitar, even though it was a lyre, out in the fields, and his audience is sheep and birds, right? I mean, I wonder how expensive those tickets would be today. And so in verse 21, we're told David came to Saul and entered the service and soon found favor in his sight. And later in verse 23, we learn that whenever the harmful spirit from God was upon Saul, David took the lyre and played it with his hand. So Saul was refreshed and was well, and the harmful spirit departed from him. And so I often think about this. What is it about art that makes us feel refreshed and well? And so it's helpful to remember that David was an artist, especially when we think about the next time we encounter David, which is shortly after in chapter 17. And again, this is the famous story of the flannel graphs, right? So we find David visiting his brothers on the battlefield, and Saul and the men of Israel are facing their biggest challenge in Goliath of Gath. And so after 40 days of just being deadlocked with their enemy, David shows up for this climactic and memorable scene. And he has this kind of, again, this full understanding of the Lord's power, and he confidently convinces Saul to help him fight the giant. So I was thinking about this as I was preparing, and I just thought, how desperate did Saul have to be to put the whole future of the kingdom of Israel in the hands of the guitar player? Like, have y'all ever thought about that? He had completely and utterly given up, right? And he's like, sure, you do it, artist. I was like, wow, okay. And so anyway, well, we know the rest of the story. The Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's. The author Malcolm Gladwell points out in the opening chapter of his book, David and Goliath, that David is the perfect foe to take down the giant Goliath. Instead of using Saul's armor to fight a conventional battle, the young musician saw the situation differently and used his creativity to change the rules of combat. David was an artist. This is what artists do. David had a deep faith and understood the power of the Lord. He also possessed the imagination necessary to see an alternative way around the obstacle in front of him. Artists, use your imagination and the creative spirit the Lord gave you to help your congregations see and experience the Lord in new and God-glorifying ways. Okay, so I have one more story that I think is a great illustration of what can happen when artists mobilize a community. So in April of 2002, the contemporary artist Francis Elise set out on his most ambitious art project of his career. So Elise is not an artist of faith, but his work often takes on a religious framework. He's a conceptual artist. Here's a piece of his. He's a conceptual artist, meaning the ideas behind his work, okay, so the ideas are more important than the finished art objects like paintings and sculptures. And so Elise's work looks like social encounters in which he participates in some form of seemingly absurd action. And so, for example, this is him in 1995. He pushed a block of ice through the streets of Mexico City for 9 hours until it melted. He also carried a can of green paint with a hole in the bottom along the 1948 Israeli-Jordanian border, which is known as the Green Line. And as the paint dripped, it created this kind of paint trail, a green paint trail behind him. As a result, these actions take on new meanings and highlight issues related to the social systems and structures that shape human interaction. Many acknowledge his masterpiece to be the project he created in 2002 called When Faith Moves Mountains. So in this piece, Elise attempted to achieve a simple goal. He wanted to move a mountain. So he found a sand dune on the outskirts of Lima, Peru, and recruited over 500 volunteers to help him move it. To achieve this absurd task, Elise gave each of the volunteers a shovel and a T-shirt, which guys goes to show what people will do for a free T-shirt, right? right? So he organized these volunteers into a straight line across the dune, and they started shoveling at the bottom, and they worked their way up, forward, as they shoveled in unison. So when they reached the dune's crest, the line worked its way down the other side, slowly displacing the sand forward. At the end of the exhausting day, Elise had achieved his goal. He moved the dune by 4 inches. Although what they accomplished might seem minimal, the outcome inspired a renewed hope throughout the community as word spread of the achievement. The act also achieved something else. It reminded the participants who felt helpless living in a country marked by social and political unrest of their human agency, and showed them the potential for what could be achieved when they worked with others on a shared mission. At a time when many Peruvians felt disillusioned and little could be done to change the state of things, Elise's idea was to move a mountain. Reflecting on this accomplishment, one of the participants commented, "It was weird, but a group of people, on the basis of their faith, can do things that otherwise would be impossible." Friends, when churches invite artists to participate in the life of their church, powerful things happen. The church needs artists. Let's find room in our congregations for mature and faithful artists who will teach us to sing new songs and use their artistry to declare the glory of the Lord's marvelous works among his people. To encourage and lift up those in your pews who inspire others to say, "The Lord reigns." Give artists the space to display the gladness of the heavens, the roar of the sea, and the joy of the forest. Learn to trust those artists who use their creative gifts to point others to Christ and deepen our faith. When the work of our artists echoes David's words in Psalm 96, our churches will be inspired by the beauty of God and able to move mountains. Thank you.
Now you can hear me.
Yep.
Good. All right. I too echo my thanks to Mike for the invitation to be here. It's been good to be in communication over the months about this conference and my interactions with Anna and Emily. I live and teach in northern West Virginia, about an hour and a half south of Pittsburgh, so my students thank you for my being here today. I have one image that'll be on the screen during my talk. It's a detail of Salvador Dali's Christ of St. John of the Cross, and it'll be what we meditate on as we explore the idea of defining beauty. Beauty is a word both vast and vague, an ample signifier, but a slippery one too. In a commodity culture like ours, beauty is often equated with glamour. For those of us who spend a good bit of our time thinking about the forces that shape human beings and our desires, it is worth noting that the global beauty industry, currently worth about $600 billion annually, is an unrivaled formation system. Its aim is to shape our sense of self and self-worth, assigning us physical flaws we didn't know we had, and peddling their costly cures. Many of us purchase these products religiously as the faithful consumers we've been trained to be. And in the young, and in young girls especially, the beauty industry routinely engenders shame and self-loathing, along with despair at the prospect of ever achieving the perfect face, perfect features, perfect form, and thus the perfect life. There is also beauty's long association with violence and oppression, the purity project of the Nazis, and of beauty and the beauty cult more broadly as a tool of white supremacy. Classical Greek art dictated narrow standards of human beauty, which Western Europeans in the so-called Age of Enlightenment furnished with a scientific rationale and a moral calculus. Self-appointed arbiters in that era and beyond determined that certain skin tones and eye shapes and hair types were not only lacking in beauty, but were indicators of intellectual and moral inferiority. The fiction of race, invented during this time, served to subject non-white persons and populations to dehumanization, criminalization, extermination, and we inhabit that legacy still. In other arenas of contemporary life, beauty is equated with what is pretty and pleasing to the eye, to the exclusion of what is flawed, broken, or decidedly not perfect. We rightly marvel at a gorgeous sunset or the fiery colors of autumn leaves, yet don't quite know what to do and how to locate such beauty within other processes of nature that ever increasingly give us catastrophic droughts and fires and floods. And much popular art, I'm thinking of something like Thomas Kinkade, the painter of light. That kind of art seeks to feed our hunger for homey perfection, you know, those tidy cottages and churches and fields and flowing streams, all bathed in a soft golden glow. But such paintings brush aside, I couldn't help myself, they brush aside the blemishes and defects of real places and the people who inhabit them. And even when we know this kind of art to be kitsch and we can recognize our tendency to sentimentalize the natural world, such false ideals of the beautiful still exert tremendous power over our individual and collective imaginations. Beauty is an ample signifier indeed. I've titled my talk Defining Beauty, suggesting that beauty is a word always in need of defining, and that beauty ought to be defining of our lives as persons who bear the imago Dei, the image of God. But what does it mean to speak of the beauty of God? I wonder if your experience of church has been something like mine. Namely, I have heard a good deal of talk about the love of God, the power of God, the mercy of God, and even the wrath of God. But the phrase, the beauty of God, and the historical and contemporary theology that informs it has been much less prominent in preaching, worship, and efforts at Christian formation personally and collectively, which speaks to the importance of this conference. A theological account of beauty is rooted in the triunity of God, the mutual indwelling of the co-eternal, consubstantial Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We use Trinitarian language not because we believe it allows us to define or contain or possess God, but because it functions as a kind of grammar, a set of parameters for what can and cannot be said about the relational God who exists in concord, symmetry, and gratuitous self-giving. St. Athanasius called this divine relationality reciprocal delight. Theologian Sarah Coakley describes it as ecstatic overflowing, within which is God's desire for kinship and reciprocity. This desire is born not of need or lack, since God in God's self wants for nothing. Rather, it springs from the plenitude and longing love at the heart of the triune God. This rich, evocative theology gives us language for the Trinitarian reality we detect in Scripture, even if obliquely, into which we are baptized and through which the church discovers its life together in God. This infinity of grace and love is the beauty of God. And we can say this only because Beauty makes itself known. God's beauty makes itself known in form, in the person of the Son, Jesus the Christ. He is, as the writer of Colossians puts it, the image or the icon of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him God was pleased to reconcile to God's self all things, whether on earth or in heaven, by making peace through the blood of the cross. It is the crucified one who makes divine beauty, God's own life of infinite excess, visible in the world. There is no glamour here. There is nothing sentimental about it, though sentimentality is always a temptation when we contemplate the cross. In Christ, the crucified, we encounter what Aidan Nichols calls a strange and terrible beauty. But the question is, can we perceive it? Can we see the beauty of God in the battered, broken body of the suffering Christ? And can we see in the battered, broken bodies of our suffering neighbors the beautiful Christ? As theologian Natalie Carnes puts it, to see Christ is to see God coming to love to save God coming in love to save the wounded. And perceiving the beauty of Christ requires the right attention to the ugliness of affliction. Christ's beauty, God's love made visible in the world, is revealed in vulnerability, poverty, scandal, suffering, and brokenness. This is the gospel we must preach, the song we must sing, the art we must make, the truth we must live. How do we do this? Or to ask it another way, how does or how ought the strange and terrible beauty of the crucified Christ define, inform, permeate, or otherwise animate preaching and worship in ordinary congregational life? A lot could be said about this, I'm sure, more than we have time for here, but I want to sketch a couple of responses in relation to preaching specifically and worship more generally, in the hope that they might generate other questions and reflections and responses in our time together over these 2 days. So, preaching first. Michael Pasquarello has argued persuasively that preaching prepares the church to receive the word of Christ's self-emptying love, to which the whole of Scripture attests in a unified but diverse witness to the triune God. Beautiful preaching cultivates in its hearers a holy longing, a longing that stretches us and creates a space in us where love can take up room. And it seems to me that at least two things follow from this description of the preacher's task. First, the necessity of a deep and constant care for words, and a care that is itself rooted in the conviction that the best preaching does not so much instruct or inform as arrange an encounter. When it does this, we discover how hungry we are for beauty in preaching in this era of graceless speech, of crudeness and dishonesty in our public discourse. And I think we're reminded of the unhappy truce we regularly make with a culture of empty chatter in its routine promiscuity with language. Beautiful words matter. They can be life-saving, in fact. But with Mike, I take it that the idea of beautiful preaching means not flowery elocution, but rather language which moves the hearer with its fidelity to goodness and truth. The goodness and truth that God so loved the world, and that in the crucified beauty of Christ, the one in whom all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, we and all of creation are welcomed into the eternal delight of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Moreover, Mike's description alerts us to the preacher's role in helping hearers to perceive Christ's beauty in his affliction and in those in our midst who are afflicted. In his life, death, and resurrection, Christ binds us to the broken and the brokenhearted. When love takes up room in us, when we bear witness to, even imperfectly, the perfect self-giving love of the triune God, we take up our calling to attend to the dehumanization of those who suffer and to reckon with our own complicity in their suffering. In his book, Community of the Beautiful, Alejandro Garcia Rivera casts a vision of the beauty of the cross in a liberationist light. And I think that's a welcome perspective in a field that has been dominated by Anglo scholarship. For Garcia Rivera, the beauty of the crucified Christ is in lifting up the lowly. As Jesus himself, a marginal Jew tortured and executed by imperial power, is lifted up, so are all who have suffered, who are suffering, and who will suffer. Mary, the mother of Jesus, gives voice to this at the beginning of Luke's gospel in what we know as the Magnificat, her song of praise and power that is both marching orders for the nonviolent revolution and the appointed canticle for evening prayer. And she sings in that song these lines: "He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly." If God is most decisively revealed in the strange and terrible beauty of the cross, then the God we find there is one who lifts up the lowly, the wounded bodies, as Garcia Rivera puts it, of those who are unjustly crucified. Beautiful preaching helps arrange an encounter with this truth, inviting us into God's redeeming work in the world, into a preferential love for the poor. The social dimension of redemption is clear, and we discover that our salvation, as Dorothy Day famously said, depends on the poor. This is the truth that beautiful preaching invites us to encounter. It is the good news of the gospel, God's desire that all people flourish and that all creation be made whole. As the opening lines of Colossians make evident, as we heard, and as Martin Luther King Jr. so eloquently put it, the end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. The end is the creation of the beloved community. And so secondly, worship. In his book, Community of the Beautiful, Garcia Rivera's motif of lifting up carries through to acts of communal worship. We lift our voices in song, our hands and arms in prayer and praise. The host or communion bread is lifted up at the Lord's table. In some liturgies, we say we lift up our hearts. The beauty of Christ on the cross, the lowly one lifted up, who lifts up all lowly ones, makes of us the community of the beautiful in our worship and in our work, the work we've been sent to do from it. I think we sometimes struggle, though, to see worship as inherently beautiful. Beauty, we understandably assume, is something added or extra, something we create to enhance the worship experience. I am sure we're all aware that denominations across the ecclesial spectrum are losing members at an astonishing rate, a trend that has been decades in the making and only been exacerbated by a 2+ years global pandemic. It's not surprising then that we often find ourselves trying to make worship beautiful, pleasing, attractive, and more attractive still. How else to keep people coming or to have them come back after months of online church? It has long been pointed out that this way of thinking places a misguided emphasis on individual worshipers and their likes and dislikes. Did they enjoy the music, the preaching, the praying? Will they return next Sunday? It's an approach to worship that seems to give in to the temptation to mimic or reproduce experiences from the culture at large, experiences that are designed to rivet an audience, wow a crowd, keep them coming back for more. The assumption seems to be that we are a species ever in need of amusement. You might remember, you lovely folks won't, but you might remember Rick Warren's blockbuster book from 20+ years ago, The Purpose-Driven Life, the opening lines of which are, It's not about you. That sentence and the sentiment behind it took on a life of its own, as it was invoked for all sorts of purposes in all kinds of contexts. Warren intended it as a rebuke of the narcissism of our age, the tendency to frame and evaluate everything in light of that anxious, impatient, demanding question, what is in it for me? Church leaders who worried about the niche marketing approach to planning worship and its preoccupation with the satisfaction of worshipers found an ally in Warren's catchy slogan, "It's not about you." As someone who has written a fair bit about worship, liturgy, and Christian formation, I have lots of sympathy for all of this. The prime focus of the church's worship is the adoration of God, full stop, not ourselves, our feelings, or our preferences. But here's the thing. In a very real way, worship is always and only for our sake. Maybe it's not about us, but it is for us, and just for us. And I'm indebted to the work of theologian James Allison on this point. He reminds us that God needs no worship, no adulation, no praise, no glory. No divine ego is flattered, stability maintained, nor is any threatened petulance staved off by our worship. No. The only people for whom it matters that we worship God is ourselves. It is entirely for our benefit that we are commanded to worship God, because if we don't, we will have no protection at all against the other sorts of worship. The other sorts of worship that Allison refers to is any number of ways that worship takes place in our violent world, even though we don't name it as such. Things like the liturgical forms and patterns of sporting events, or celebrity cults, or military parades. Allison offers a compelling and a chilling description of a Nuremberg rally as an example of worship in a culture of violence. Not because it is uniquely awful, but because its liturgical elements are easily recognizable. He says this, quote, "You bring people together and you unite them in worship. You provide regular rhythmic music. You give them songs to sing. You build them up with a reason for their togetherness, a reason based on a common racial heritage. You keep them waiting and the pressure building up. After the build-up, the Führer appears. They are united in fascination with this extraordinary person to whom they have handed over the task of being the chief liturgist. And he does not disappoint. The crowd is delirious, outside themselves, united in love and adoration." End quote. I actually don't think we have to go all the way back to the Nuremberg rallies of Nazi Germany to recognize this kind of false, dangerous worship in our own culture, rooted as it is in sanctioned violence, and also to recognize its enormous power to shape minds and hearts. The obverse of that kind of worship, worship in a violent world, the un-Nuremberg, as Allison refers to it, is the true worship of the true God. It is there in repetitive, mundane acts like offering our gifts or singing hymns or praying for others, acts in which we lift our hearts to God, that the gathered body entrusts itself to the crucified one so that over time we can become him and become the community of the beautiful for the life of the world. This sensibility is in contrast to the implicit, usually unspoken idea that we must somehow engineer meaningful experience in worship. For as Allison says, true Christian worship is predicated on the understanding that there is nothing left to achieve. It has already been achieved, once and for all. The struggle is over. The kingdom has been inaugurated and obtained. And part of the effect of the achievement having already been achieved is that the crucified and risen Lamb is just there. He's just there. And so we can just be. We can just be in the presence of a strange and terrible beauty that meets us in words, water, wheat, wine, elemental things made holy. In such materiality and in the company of all those gathered, we participate week by week, season by season, in the infinity of grace and love that is God's own life. The infinity of grace and love that bodied itself into time and space, God incarnate. Beauty made visible in the life of one who preached the upside-down kingdom of God. Beauty made visible in his death, a death that subsumes and transforms all suffering and death. Beauty made visible in his resurrection glory, in which all are lifted up as Christ's own beloved. When we realize that we can just be in worship, we are free to abandon what Richard Lisher calls the scavenger hunt for novelty. We can trust that silence in worship is not a void we must rush to fill, but a gift we both offer and receive, the only appropriate response to having our desires and thus our hearts and our ways of being with each other completely transformed. And not for our sake only. We move from silence to speech and action as we are sent forth from the liturgy, from our worship, in the knowledge that the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the communion of the Holy Spirit go with us. This is the Trinitarian company we keep, as personally and collectively we enter again week by week, season by season, into the work that worship prepares us for, which is keeping company with the afflicted, the wounded, the disaffected, and disenfranchised. The one who, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, disregarding its shame. That one has shown us our work, shown us that the love and beauty of God is revealed in vulnerability, poverty, scandal, suffering, and brokenness. This is the gospel we must preach, the song we must sing, the art we must make, the truth we must live. Worship, beautiful worship, it's for us and for the whole world. Thank you.
Thank you, Debra and Kevin and Joe. I'm going to hand the mic to Josh. We have until 4 and a good opportunity for conversation now.
Especially music, hymns, and anthems, also with any kind of songs. Instead of being concerned and often offended about the different cultural styles of music, shouldn't we be more concerned about the content of the music?
I would say both and I think, like how I started was talking about, I do think sometimes we think as long as the words are true, then the form doesn't matter. I don't think that's true, because we're embodied beings and not just, as Jamie Smith likes to say, brains on sticks. So I do think, and I think we live in a creation that has, the creation's not fallen, but it's frustrated. And so you've got, you're always working with kind of shades of gray in some ways, though I can't use that term anymore, with regard to human cultural productions. And that's why I think commending what we can and seeking to have, the form bring out, again, not just sublime, but, the kind of hard, nails and blood and all that stuff, the whole range. I think music's a great vehicle for that. All kinds of art are. So I think it's both and. It doesn't have to be either or.
So one of the things that you said in your first presentation was that musical styles have cultural baggage, and I agree with that statement. So, but here's the issue. What becomes the either standard or tool by which you evaluate that cultural baggage so that it's simply not a matter of my opinion versus your opinion of what it is, this particular style of music appropriate, not appropriate? Because that seems to be my greatest frustration where these conversations leads. It just kind of boils down to, well, I don't think that's right for church, or this is right for church, or that's not right for church. And it seems like there's no objectivity towards it that elevates the conversation outside of simply my opinion versus yours. So that's my question.
I think pure objectivity is possible, again, because we're embodied beings. And that's why, but I also think it's good to do this in a community. And for one of the things that I've found helpful is to talk about why you're doing what you're doing, because it really helps people not just respond as consumers. So that if they know, like, why are we singing this thing that might stretch you, like Marva Dawn's line. Like, I use that a lot. Say, for instance, if we're going to do a conference and we're going to invite a historic Black university, Jackson State, to lead worship at the RUF National Conference with our group, we're gonna do some songs that may be culturally uncomfortable, but there's a good reason to do that. So I think that there's not one objective standard that's going to work for every congregation. You know, you got to understand who your people are. And I think try to have a conversation with all the stakeholders and try to make that a diverse community that interacts. I think so often we have these conversations with kind of little silos, like these people are talking and these people are talking, they never talk to each other. And I've just found, like, you know, if like the college students hate this, you know, kind of cheesy praise chorus, but the baby boomers have got their eyes closed and their hands raised, it's good to talk about why. Right? I think one of the things I found, you know, I think an article I wrote, I invoked this a sign I'd seen in an antique store that said, my grandmother saved it, my mother threw it away, and now I'm buying it back. But I do think that in some ways, like, at least in church music, the baby boomers kind of threw out things that were old, and the students really are interested to hear these things that shaped. I would say worship is formative, always, like it or not. And that means you have to attend to all these things, and you need to kind of know what you're doing, what you're forming. But I don't think there's just, for me, I don't feel threatened or lose sleep over there's no objective standard, like that these are the good songs and these are the bad. I just think it depends on the week, depends on all kinds of things. Depends on who you are and who your community is, but also where you're trying to get them to be, not just in the comfort zone. You know, kind of like preaching, right? I don't think it's that different in some ways.
Hello. So, you guys talked about like beauty and suffering and how the Psalms portrays a wide array of emotions. And I wanted to ask what you think that would look like practically in worship, like what we would actually do.
Yeah, thank you. A couple of quick thoughts, and I'm sure there's more that could be said that I'll think of later. I notice in lectionaries that we don't really like to do the Psalms of Lament, the imprecatory Psalms, the Psalms that talk about suffering and our own anger. And I think that's a poverty of worship, the way we excise what might be uncomfortable. So I do think that becomes a strategic choice for people who plan worship in certain contexts, to see where are the gaps in, and maybe, I mean, there are probably churches here that don't follow a lectionary, I'm aware of that, but so for people who do have more freedom to choose the text, to take the risk of letting those psalms of lament, anger, the cursing psalms have their voice, because that's, you just said they contain the whole range of human emotion. And they give us permission, I think. They give us language to be able to express that to God. So I think it requires some risk. That occurs to me.
I want to add on that. I mean, part of really what I started looking for other songs to sing is because I felt that the songs that we were singing with our college students in the late 90s were lying to them about the Christian faith and what the normal Christian life felt like. And they were listening on the radio to Alanis Morissette, and then we don't have any songs that can speak about that. And then I was looking through an old hymnal, and I found this song by Anne Steele, 18th century Baptist hymn writer, called Dear Refuge of My Weary Soul. And it's like, says things that just got excised. I mean, I remember seeing a billboard for K-Love, Christian radio station. I don't know if you have that down here, but there's a billboard between Nashville and Memphis, and it said, K-Love Christian radio station, safe for the whole family. I just think, that's so awful. That's not the point of this. But I think for sure, my friend Trevor Lawrence just spoke at a conference I was at last week on the imprecatory Psalms, and it was incredible how important that is, that we actually have Christian words to say about the things that we're seeing around us, that we don't have to edit that stuff out. But you're right, we do. And so I've always told people I was looking for songs that were more honest about struggle and more explicit about the gospel and not just telling God how we feel. There's a place for that. We also need to hear about how God feels about us. So that's what I mean by worship is formative, like it or not, and sometimes it's misforming, malforming when we edit things out like she's talking about.
One back here, and then I'll come to you.
I'm a worship leader, and I grew up in a fundamentalist tradition with the old hymns, and I love them to death. And our demographic is probably 60 plus. So, in addition, of course, I love all the newer top 40 Christian music. Not all of it, but a good bit of it. But I try to work the hymns, a lot of hymns, into our services. I was wondering if you could expand on your reworking of hymns. Are these traditional favorites, or are these songs that you're going back and finding? Because I'm a new Coke kind of guy, to use a cultural reference that'll be totally lost on them. If something is good, which to me I really prefer not to hear a reharmonization or a tweaking of the melodies of the traditional songs. I was wondering if you could expand on your method.
Yeah, so we were never out to deconstruct church music. And I think, on the first record that we did, we probably had some tunes that we put to hymns that people did still sing. But in our context, nobody was singing those anymore. And I'd found them in old hymnals. Like I had a copy of John Rippon's collection, 1806. So those hymnals before the Civil War don't have tunes in them. They're just texts. So I was finding a hymn like Dear Refuge of My Weary Soul, but that hasn't been in a hymnal for 100 years. So I didn't get any angry letters about that. I did get from some of the others. So I actually really, again, there's some tunes that work really well and are adaptable from a pipe organ to a guitar. In our context, we had a guitar, so we were limited, but the tunes that were, I heard Paul Westermeyer do a talk one time, actually at Calvin, I think, on hymn tunes that transcend generations. They tend to be the ones that are rooted in folk music. And so some of those traditional tunes worked pretty well. Others didn't, but I still would argue that even a familiar hymn with a familiar tune, sometimes it's helpful to put a new tune to it, because I think every text has more emotional range than any particular tune can bring out. Sometimes you hear the words afresh. There's a lullaby tune for Rock of Ages that brings out, I would say, Clef for me. And then there's the traditional rock of it that's like rock of ages, right? And I think both of those are in that text, and you bring out different aspects. So I've tended to go look for hymns that never even made it into a hymn book. So it's one thing to find the 50 songs that Ann Steele wrote that made it into hymn books, but she wrote 212 hymns. And some of those weren't as necessary then, but we might need them now because there's gaps, you know, as things. And I would say for me, you know, some of you know that like the Higher Life, Let Go, Let God Christian movement, I think that had a big impact on removing a lot of the songs that are talking about the battle the Christian life is. It's a fight to believe. It's not easy, but that whole movement says if it's easy or you're doing it wrong. And I think that's affected a lot of the songs that we don't sing anymore. And it's really unhelpful. It's part of what I mean about lying to people. So I was never out to redo, you know, old tunes if they work, but I really was looking for texts that had fallen out of use and finding a way to sing them.
So this is back to sort of what you were talking about, singing songs that depict suffering, that are laments and all that. So kind of similar to that, we actually had a conversation amongst us worship apprentices at Calvin about one particular song, Reckless Love by Cory, which some of you might be familiar with. And so we were talking about like the usage of the word reckless, like, right? Like what are you implying by calling God's love reckless? But then again, it's also true. It's an authentic expression of the human faith journey. Like sometimes God's love does feel reckless, but what theological risks are you putting there? And so I was wondering, like, maybe like to both of you, like what is your take on that, I guess?
I don't know the song, so I'll be brief, because I think one thing, and I think there was a hint of this in John's presentation this morning, it follows that very helpful way of putting it. You're preparing worship for people, but also people for worship. It's how do we do, I think what I put in something I wrote a long time ago, it's sort of extra liturgical catechesis, meaning like how do we teach outside the liturgy, outside of worship in ways that's not didactic or feels like school, but in some ways is helping people with those kind of nuances. And that can take lots of forms. A pastor can do it, other church leaders can do it, but I do think sometimes when you just put something out there and there's no framing around it, before or after, you do run the risk of misunderstanding. So just being creative about ways to help people think about what we're doing and why we're doing it. And that's case by case, church by church.
Yeah, I think that's well said. Ron and Debra Reinstra have a book, Worship Words, isn't that what it's called? That's a whole book devoted to even those linking words that set things up. So, I think if it brings up a conversation, it's good. We haven't sung that one in our group. I don't exactly know why. I haven't told them we can't, but I don't pick the songs, so they've kind of picked other ones. I think it's kind of provocative, and I'm probably a bit of an iconoclast, so I probably would be inclined to maybe do it and then talk about why. I think if you talk about why you're doing what you're doing, you can do a lot of things. If you just, like she's saying, leave it to people to kind of wonder, especially in our day and age, they'll feel like you did it because you want to thumb your nose at somebody or because, you just want to be edgy. I always think, there's an article that Nicholas Wolterstorff did years ago in Worship Leader magazine, which I could get you a copy of, The Artist as Servant. And he talks about one of the real barriers a lot of worship leaders have is the training that people receive in art schools and music schools is to think of artists as like kind of above everybody else. That's a very unhelpful paradigm when you think about leading congregations in worship. But most people trained as artists are trained with that kind of model. And so that's another barrier. So a song like that, it's like, I wrote it, and it can't be edited, and the community doesn't get to speak into whether that's appropriate or not. I would resist that kind of attitude. And unfortunately, with the term worship artist, I'm not real happy with that label, having been a veteran of the Christian music industry. It's very strange. We used to basically make Christian musicians do altar calls, which most of them weren't really prepared to do, but they were brought in because it was the evangelism budget that brought them in, and they had to do that. Now every artist is regarded as a worship artist, and for some of them, that's not really what their calling is. It's the only way to have a vocation in the Christian contemporary music world. I just think that's really unfortunate.
First off, I want to validate you. Thank you so much. No, seriously, because bringing in the visual arts have brought in people like my husband that are complete nerds, which, by the way, I picked up every single nerd reference you did. Because it gives him a place to come in, right? Like, he does not care for worship music. We jokingly call it the meat and three with the sprinkle of dessert at the end, right? Which was my history question, by the way, was when did that become the standard? Excuse me, because bringing in the arts has given him a reason to want to serve the church. He hasn't had a place since then. Me, I can go in and I'm a quiet worshiper. I'm in, just according to what kind of day I'm having, but he hasn't had a place. And so bringing in the arts, he has found the beauty. And so I thank you and I validate you for that, because it gives a whole place of people that have not had an opportunity to be taught to. Because if you don't care for music, I mean, he would rather listen to Tupac on the way to church than, and then listen to a good message. But if you give him an opportunity to put that music to visual arts and put his, what he can do in it. So thank you, and I validate you. And that was my question. My history question was, when did that become the standard of the meet and three sermon kind of like service?
Oh, yeah. So the recent history is that coming out of worship that was really shaped for evangelism. I mean, you could trace the history of revivalistic worship patterns where a musician would prepare the way, and an evangelistic preacher would preach to the altar call. So that's all in the background, but of course that always existed, and I'm aware here I'm speaking across multiple Christian traditions, that always existed sort of in a fascinating sort of interplay with services of word, and often services of word and sacrament, and often services of word and sacrament that had many other purposes, including public prayer, preaching that was more doxological and less directly aimed and evangelistic. But that revivalistic tradition has been prominent in evangelical Protestant for a long while. What was fascinating in the last a couple generations is the profound influence of the charismatic movement, and how the three-song pattern for some, in some traditions, was very much linked with the kind of interior architecture that draws on temple imagery to depict the inward journey of our soul that enters the courts with thanksgiving and moves musically into the Holy of Holies, using that Old Testament architecture to shape a musical journey. And that pattern really became more prominent in a variety of charismatic circles. And Lester and Young Lim have written a great deal about this in the history of the contemporary worship movement, and have really, I think, helped us understand how a lot of what we come to know as contemporary worship is actually a fusion of at least three things. A certain worship as evangelism vision that a lot like old style revivalism, along with the power of that sort of charismatic interior shaping of the soul approach, combined with the energy of ship industry. I mean, those three things all come together. So in some places, 3 songs leading into a teaching time feels like all worship has ever been. And then in some contexts, that has displaced something like the order of service that looks absolutely wonderful that we'll experience tonight, which involves a lot more interplay of music and prayers and texts and word and table. And so it's a little hard to generalize without thinking about a specific church's journey, but there's absolutely no doubt that there's a big fusion experiment that's happened recently between that revival tradition, charismatic tradition, and the high-powered worship industry coming together.
John, do you think even like songs replacing the central role of the sacrament? It seems like yeah. I mean, the Presbyterians have a big part to play in that. Yeah, like quarterly worship, singing and then the Baptistic tradition that comes off of that. Right. That was the first thing I noticed at Calvin was how different that whole tradition, liturgical, was from the songs kind of do the work of the sacrament.
Thank you all. Thank you. Now we have a break until 5. At 5, we'll and a time to visit, talk with our speakers. Just enjoy being here. Refreshments out here. But at 5, we'll meet at the University Center, right up the hill. You'll see a sign in front of the entrance, Beauty of God Conference, and you'll walk in and you'll go straight, and there's an O. Henry's coffee shop, and right next to that is the area where we will gather to eat. And then John is, after we eat, John is going to have a panel discussion, lead a panel discussion among our speakers to follow up on what we've already done. So there'll be more opportunity, to engage with what we've done this afternoon. So thank you again to Debra, to Kevin, and Joe very, very much. We will see you up there at 5.